Hello, I'm Ed Murphy with the Astronomy Department at the University of Virginia, and this is Astronomy 3450 Mission to Mars, Lecture 6, Early Human Spaceflight. In our last lecture, we talked about the early days of the space program in both the United States and the Soviet Union, and we saw the first satellites launched by both nations. These satellites were fairly simple. They weren't complicated, and they could carry out just simple tasks. So it was realized in order to carry out complicated tasks and in the natural progression of technology that eventually humans would fly in space. So in 1958, NASA formed a group called the Space Task Group, which was headquartered at the NASA Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. And they were tasked with managing the human spaceflight program. They called this first human spaceflight program Project Mercury, and the goal was to put a human into orbit, return them safely to Earth, and preferably do it before the Soviet Union. And in 1959, April of 1959, NASA announced the selection of the first astronauts into the human spaceflight program, and these were known as the Mercury 7 astronauts. Now, the way they went about selecting these 7 astronauts was they reviewed the service records of all pilots who had graduated from test pilot school in the United States. Eventually, they selected 69 candidates who met the minimum qualifications, and they were brought to the Pentagon for a briefing on the program. They were given standardized IQ tests, engineering and math aptitude tests. They underwent psychiatric evaluations, and they underwent absolutely grueling and infamous physical and psychological tests. Now, the requirements to be an astronaut, especially in these early days, were quite stringent. You had to be less than 40 years old. You had to be less than 5 feet 11 inches tall. You had to be in excellent physical condition. You had to have a bachelor's degree or equivalent. You had to be a graduate of a test pilot school. You needed to have at least 1,500 hours of flying time in high-performance jet fighter aircraft. And you, of course, had to be a qualified jet pilot. So in this first round of astronaut selection, they selected 7 individuals. And those 7 individuals have now gone on to be known as the Mercury 7. And they are Gus Grissom from the U.S. Air Force, Alan Shepard from the U.S. Navy, Scott Carpenter from the U.S. Navy, Wally Schirra from the U.S. Navy, Deke Slayton from the U.S. Air Force, John Glenn from the U.S. Marine Corps, and Gordon Cooper from the U.S. Air Force. As you can see, all of them were military test pilots, and they were introduced to the public on April the 9th, 1959. They were going to fly into space the Mercury capsule. So the Mercury capsule was the first capsule designed by the U.S. for carrying humans into orbit. It consisted of the capsule itself. It had a launch escape tower that was mounted onto the top of it. This orange-colored tower on the top had 3 solid rocket motors here that could fire in an emergency, and it would pull the Mercury capsule away from the rocket. So should a problem occur on launch or just before launch, this escape tower could be used to pull the capsule away. Fitted onto the bottom of the capsule here was the retro reentry package. This contained 3 solid fuel rockets that would be used for reentry into the atmosphere. You can see that it was held on by a series of cables. Once they fired those rockets to slow the spacecraft down to re-enter into the atmosphere, these cables would be severed and the re-entry package would fall away, and the astronauts would be protected by a heat shield on re-entry into the atmosphere. The capsule itself consisted of a pressurized cabin, so the cabin was pressurized to allow the astronaut to breathe. It carried enough water, food, and oxygen for about a day in space. I've already mentioned the launch escape tower here, and it had parachutes in the nose cone here that were used for landing. So once they came through the atmosphere with the heat shield slowing them down, eventually the capsule would slow fall enough that it was just falling to Earth. They would then deploy the parachutes and it would land in the water for a water landing. You'll notice from this diagram that the Mercury capsule was not much bigger than the astronaut themselves. One of the jokes in the early Mercury program was that the astronaut didn't get into the capsule so much as they strapped the capsule on. So you can see here an astronaut sitting inside the Mercury capsule. Up here in the nose cone, we've got the main parachute, we've got the reserve parachute, we've got a drogue parachute, which came out early, stabilized the spacecraft, and then the force of that was used to pull the main parachute out of its canister. There was an antenna located up here on the top, the control panel that the astronaut would use when sitting in the spacecraft, and then located around the spacecraft were various roll, pitch, and yaw jets. So these jets allowed them to control the pitch, the yaw, and then the roll of the spacecraft. There was a small hatch for getting into and out of the spacecraft, and then down here at the bottom we have the heat shield and the retro rocket package down here at the bottom that had the retro rockets to bring them home. Here's a picture of one of the Mercury capsules being constructed at McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis in 1960 before its flight. So that's what the spacecraft looked like. Now, the rocket that would be used to launch the spacecraft was the Mercury Redstone 1. The Mercury Redstone 1 consisted of an alcohol tank, a liquid oxygen tank, feeding a single rocket engine, and that rocket engine could be steered with graphite vanes that were located in the exhaust from the rocket, and then also some rudders, as they call them, or some fins located on the outside of the rocket. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, it should. In fact, it is almost identical to the German V2 rocket. Or I shouldn't say identical to, but at least it was built on the same format as the German V2 rocket, with its alcohol and water tank, liquid oxygen, feeding a single rocket engine, and then being steered by graphite vanes in the exhaust of the engine, and then fins or rudders on the outside of the fins that could be used for some steering as well. So the Mercury Redstone rocket was largely derived from the German V2 by Wernher von Braun and his team. Now, before they would send a human into space, they wanted to do testing, and so they did a few early tests with chimpanzees. And in fact, the most famous was launched on January the 31st, 1961, when a chimpanzee by the name of Ham was launched into orbit, was launched into space, and the mission was called Ham in a Can, because Ham was stuffed in the Mercury capsule. Now, this flight did not go perfectly. Ham did survive the flight. I want to mention that right up front. But early or late in the boost phase, when the booster was going up, it depleted all the liquid oxygen in the booster, and that triggered the launch abort system. Well, the rocket was almost finished propelling the capsule into space, and at the very last moment, this launch abort system fired, and that gave the capsule extra velocity. In fact, a significant amount of extra velocity. In addition, during this abort, the system automatically detached the retro rockets. So now Ham's automatic capsule, Ham of course wasn't controlling the capsule was going much too fast, and it had no way to slow down. So initially, they were planned to have Ham reach an altitude of about 115 miles. He ended up reaching an altitude of 157, and he ended up going 422 miles downrange when it was only planned that he'd go about 290. The reentry forces were quite severe. He experienced almost 15 times the force of gravity, 15 Gs on reentry, which was about 3 Gs more than was planned. The failure of this system, the failure of the Redstone rocket and the reentry systems on this flight, caused NASA to do another test flight, which was called the Mercury Redstone BD flight on March the 24th, 1961. And you'll see in a minute why this was important. After his flight, by the way, Ham was transferred to the National Zoo, where he lived for 17 years, and then finally a zoo in North Carolina, where he lived for 2. And Ham lived to the age of 26. If you're interested, he's buried at the New Mexico Museum of Space History in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Because of the failure on this flight on January 31st and the need to do a second flight on March the 24th, 1961, NASA's first human spaceflight was delayed. And of course, this delay was critical because on the 12th of April, 1961, the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin and the Vostok 1 mission. Once again, United States prestige was devastated by the fact that the Soviet Union beat them to a significant space first, or significant space milestone, in this case, the launch of the first human. So Vostok is Russian for East or Orient. It was called the Vostok 1 mission, and it carried Yuri Gagarin on a single orbit of the Earth. The mission lasted about 108 minutes, and Yuri Gagarin orbited in an orbit that went from 169 to 327 kilometers. That's about 91 miles by 177 miles. The spacecraft that he used was the Vostok 1 spacecraft. It consisted of a couple parts. There was the main pressurized capsule itself, where the astronauts sat inside of an ejection seat right here, and then there was what we would call a service module attached to the back of it right here. Interestingly, the Vostok 1 mission was intended to be completely automatically controlled. Russian scientists and doctors didn't know what would happen to a human being in the weightlessness of space for a single orbit. They weren't sure that Gagarin would be able to control his spacecraft. So the spacecraft was designed to be fully automatically controlled for the full flight. Now, if Gagarin needed to take control of the mission, there was an envelope on board that had controls, that had codes that he could use to unlock the controls. But a number of people that were involved in the mission felt that that was dangerous, that he didn't know the codes. And so they actually told Gagarin the codes ahead of time so that he would know how to unlock the controls in case he needed to. So Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space on April the 12th, 1961. And that is another date that I want you to memorize. I think there are a couple important dates that you really need to commit to memory. The Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite put into orbit, and of course Yuri Gagarin, the first flight of a human. Tragically, by the way, Yuri Gagarin died in 1968 on March the 27th in a routine training flight. You might wonder, how did Gagarin get picked for the flight? Well, the Soviet Union had a number of cosmonauts that they were considering for this first flight. For at least a few months before the flight, Gagarin was the most popular choice amongst the other cosmonauts. But the head of the the Soviet cosmonaut program, Nikolai Kamainin was undecided even a few days before the flight who would take the flight. So his two favorites were Yuri Gagarin and German Titov. Now, German Titov was the stronger of the two, and the planned second flight, Vostok 2, would be a full day-long mission. And Kamainin felt that he needed the stronger of the two pilots for the longer, harder, more arduous mission that was coming up. And so he selected Gagarin to fly first, and German Titov would fly the second flight. As I mentioned, Yuri Gagarin completed a single orbit of the Earth, so he was launched from today what we call the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, made a single orbit of the Earth, and then while he was over Africa, he fired his retro rockets to slow himself down, and then entered through the Earth's atmosphere, and then landed in the Soviet Union. These are a couple pictures of Gagarin in his flight suit, a Huntsville newspaper that announces the first flight, and then finally in a museum in Russia today, you can see the Vostok 1 spacecraft, and you can see Yuri Gagarin mounted in that ejection seat. Now, what wasn't revealed about the flight until many years later was that Gagarin did not come down with the spacecraft. In the early days, it was deemed too dangerous to have the spacecraft parachute all the way to the ground, so Gagarin was actually seated inside of an ejection seat. And a couple kilometers above the surface of the Earth, as they were coming down on a parachute, Gagarin was ejected from the capsule on the ejection seat and then used his own parachute to come down to the Earth. The Soviet Union kept this a secret because they were afraid that various groups that keep aeronautical records would not credit Gagarin with the first human spaceflight because he didn't occupy the spacecraft all the way down to the surface, but instead ejected and parachuted down just the last few kilometers. And this was done, by the way, on all the early Vostok flights. But so that was kept secret for many years afterwards. One of the more interesting stories that came out of this flight is that when Gagarin parachuted down to the surface of the Earth, a number of local residents saw him in his spacesuit dragging his parachute. And in one of the quotes of his mission, he said, "When they saw me in my spacesuit and the parachute dragging alongside as I walked, they started to back away from me in fear. I told them, 'Don't be afraid. I am a Soviet citizen like you who is descended from space, and I must find a telephone to call Moscow.'" Well, the United States was prepared after that second Mercury Redstone flight that did not have either a chimpanzee or a human on it to do the first human flight into space. And this would be U.S. astronaut Alan Shepard, one of the Mercury 7. And this flight was on May the 5th, 1961, on the Mercury Freedom 7 mission. Now, Mercury Freedom 7 was a ballistic mission. That is, Alan Shepard did not go into orbit around the Earth. He was launched from Cape Canaveral, was supposed to reach an altitude of around 125 miles and then come down not quite 200 miles downrange. In fact, the ballistic flight reached an altitude of 116.5 miles and traveled about 302 miles downrange. Alan Shepard experienced about 6.3 G on launch and almost 12 G on reentry, and the total flight time was about 15 minutes and 22 seconds. After launch, and then once the spacecraft separated from the rocket, it would continue on a ballistic trajectory. During the few minutes that Alan Shepard had in weightlessness in space, he had a number of tests. He took manual control of the spacecraft, did some visual observations through a periscope, initiated the retrofire, took some photographs of the Earth from in space, and then re-entered through the atmosphere, deployed the parachute, and landed on water. So to give you an idea of what this mission was like, here's the launch of the Mercury Redstone 3, as it was called. Today we call the mission Freedom 7. That was the name of the spacecraft that Alan Shepard gave. He named his Mercury capsule that, and there's Alan Shepard just after launch. Right before launch that morning, Alan Shepard had a breakfast of steak and eggs with toast, coffee, and orange juice. And what's interesting is this has become the tradition in American spaceflight, is that on the morning of launch, astronauts have the same breakfast that Alan Shepard did, which was steak and eggs with toast, coffee, and orange juice. Alan Shepard entered the spacecraft about a little after 5 o'clock in the morning for his scheduled 7:20 launch time. And remember, the mission was only supposed to be about 15 minutes long. But there were various delays during the morning. There was a delay because of cloud cover. There was a delay because computers needed to be reset at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. There was a power supply issue. There were all kinds of problems that cropped up through the morning. So one delay led to another delay, led to another delay. And eventually, Alan Shepard had been sitting inside the capsule for about 4 hours, and he had the need to urinate. It hadn't been planned to account for this because the mission, again, was only supposed to be 15 minutes long. But now he'd been in the capsule for 4 hours. So he expressed to mission control that he had an urgent need to urinate. The problem was he was now strapped into the capsule, and the access to the capsule had been removed away from the rocket in preparation for launch. NASA informed him that to bring back the white room, the room that's attached around the capsule that the astronaut uses to get into and out of the capsule, would take a long time. They'd probably end up having to scrub the mission for the day. So he told them that he was going to go ahead and just urinate in his suit. NASA warned him that he was fitted with all these electrical sensors to measure breathing rate and heart rate and temperature and pulse, and that he would short these out if he urinated in his suit. But ultimately, they had no choice. He told them to turn off the electricity that was feeding these sensors. They did so, and Alan Shepard famously urinated in his suit. Now, the suit was being fed by oxygen, and this oxygen quickly dried him out. Now, right before launch, literally just minutes before launch, yet another problem cropped up. Alan Shepard was quite frustrated by all the delays in this first flight, and he finally announced to mission control, "I'm cooler than you are. Why don't you fix your little problem and light this candle?" So they did, in fact, solve that problem with the oxygen tank on the rocket and launch Alan Shepard into space. Here's a quick video that I'll show you about the launch of Alan Shepard.
A feeling of confidence. As astronaut Shepard goes through the pre-launch countdown, he knows the system is as ready as human effort can make it. Doctors in the Mercury Control Center and the blockhouse monitor Shepard's physiological status during the countdown. Astronaut Gordon Cooper, assigned to the blockhouse during the launch operation, stays in direct voice contact with Shepard. As the gantry is pulled back, the emergency vehicle known as the cherry picker is raised into position. All elements of the mission have reported ready to the control center, and the launch is go.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All right, lift off and the clock is started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear. This is Freedom 7. The fuel is go, 1.2 G. Cabin at 14 PSI. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure is holding at 5.5. Cabin holding at 5.5. Fuel is go, 2.5 G. Cabin 5.5. Oxygen is go. The main bus is 24. And the isolated battery is 29. Seven here. Fuel is go, 4G. 5.5 cabin. Oxygen go. All systems are go.
So that was a little video clip on the first U.S. human space flight. This is a picture that Alan Shepard took on his trajectory. Again, a ballistic trajectory. It's important to emphasize the difference here between Yuri Gagarin's flight, which was an actual orbit of the Earth, and the U.S. first flight, Alan Shepard's flight, which was just a short 15-minute ballistic flight. Alan Shepard's rocket, the Mercury Redstone, did not have enough delta V, did not have enough power to put the astronaut in orbit, just enough to send them on a short ballistic flight. Shepard splashed down in the Caribbean and was retrieved, was picked up from the Caribbean. So you can see here a helicopter. You can see Shepard actually dangling underneath the helicopter right there. As he came out of the capsule, hooked himself into a harness, was hoisted up into the helicopter, and then the helicopter took Shepard and the capsule back to a waiting ship. Now, what's remarkable is after this single space flight, the John F. Kennedy would announce to a joint session of Congress that I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. You'll remember this from the very first lecture on the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. Kennedy said this in May of 1961 after just Alan Shepard's single flight in space. So, as of May 1961, these were our two spaceflight experiences, Yuri Gagarin on the 12th of April, Alan Shepard on the 5th of May. The second U.S. flight, the third overall human space flight, was Liberty Bell 7. It was the Mercury Redstone 4 mission on July the 21st, 1961. Like Alan Shepard's mission, this was a quick ballistic mission. It was not an Earth orbit, and the astronaut selected to fly this mission was Gus Grissom. So he was the second American to fly in space. And again, it was a 15-minute, 30-second ballistic flight. Here's Gus Grissom getting into the capsule. During recovery efforts in the Caribbean, in this case, the hatch unexpectedly blew off of the capsule. And because the hatch blew off of the capsule started to fill with water. Gus Grissom got out of the capsule. And when Grissom was out of the capsule in the water, his spacesuit started to fill with water. The rescuers didn't realize that Grissom was struggling with staying afloat, and they were concentrating their efforts on trying to save the capsule. But the capsule had already filled with water. It was too heavy for the helicopter to lift, so eventually they had to cut the capsule free and let it sink to the bottom of the sea. They did rescue Grissom, but as I said, Grissom had come very close to drowning at the end of this mission. The capsule itself wasn't recovered until 1999. NASA just abandoned the capsule at the bottom of the sea and left it there. But a private salvage group in 1999 located the Liberty Bell 7 at a depth of 16,000 feet and were able to recover the capsule, and it's now on display. The second Soviet spaceflight, the fourth overall human spaceflight, was Vostok 2. And this was launched on August the 6th, 1961. And German Titov orbited the Earth 17 times for a mission that lasted 25 hours. At the time of his flight, he was just 25 years old, and that makes him the youngest person ever to fly in space, even to this day. Because his flight was so long, he did more than a single orbit. Remember, the two U.S. flights to this point were ballistic flights, and Yuri Gagarin had only done a single orbit of the Earth. German Titov has the dubious honor of being the first person to suffer from space adaptation syndrome. That's basically motion sickness. He experienced nausea and vomiting during his mission. He tested manual control of the Vostok in a successful mission that set the space duration record of a day, over a day in space. The first U.S. orbital mission would be John Glenn in February of 1962. The Mercury Redstone rocket did not have enough power to put a Mercury capsule into orbit, so the U.S. selected a separate booster called the Atlas D. Now, the Atlas D was originally designed as an intercontinental ballistic missile to deliver giant nuclear payloads. Remember, in these days, nuclear weapons were much, much larger than they are today, and they required very large rockets to deliver them. And so these early rockets, as we saw in both the Russian space, the Soviet space program and the U.S. space program, these early rockets were all derived from intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Atlas D was what was termed a stage-and-a-half vehicle. You'll notice that there are three main engines here. The two outer engines would burn for a few minutes, and then they would drop off the rocket, and it would sustain itself on that single engine at the center. The Atlas rocket itself was designed around two fuel tanks that were pressurized. These pressurized fuel tanks maintain the structural integrity of the rocket. That is, the fully fueled rocket was so fragile that it would collapse under its own weight unless these tanks were kept pressurized. And that created, in the early days of this program, a number of accidents. If you're interested in seeing them, you can find the lecture notes and watch these YouTube videos to see some of the failures where these tanks became unpressurized and the rocket literally crumpled or folded on itself. Now, the Atlas D also turned out to be fairly unreliable in these early tests. There were a number of spectacular explosions and other failures, and so it was considered quite risky to put an astronaut on board the top of the Mercury Atlas as it became known. Because it was deemed dangerous, they decided again to do a test flight with a chimpanzee on November the 29th, 1961. A chimpanzee by the name of Enos completed the first Mercury orbital mission. Enos completed 2 orbits of the Earth before coming back down. The first U.S. human orbital mission was Friendship 7, and that was launched on February the 20th, 1962. The astronaut was famously, of course, John Glenn. He was the first American to orbit the Earth. It's important to realize that many people think John Glenn was the first U.S. astronaut in space. He was not. He was preceded by Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom. He was, in fact, the first American to orbit the Earth, but not the first American in space. Glenn was originally scheduled to complete 7 orbits of the Earth, but partway through his mission, about 3 orbits into the mission, a problem was discovered with his spacecraft, and he was brought back early after just 4 hours and 55 minutes in space. Famously, John Glenn, of course, went on to a career in politics, became a senator from Ohio, and at the age of 77 in 1998, he was offered a flight on the Space Shuttle Discovery, STS-95. And so John Glenn holds the record as his second space flight he was the oldest person that ever flew into space. The reason that Glenn never flew until 1998 after his first mission was that NASA considered him an American hero. After his flight, he was treated to ticker tape parades in all the major American cities. He was quite famous. He was considered an American hero. And they were quite concerned that he could be killed in an accident. And so NASA restricted, possibly informally restricted John Glenn from flying again. So it wasn't until 1998 that he got to have a second flight into space. So here's Glenn getting into his capsule, the Friendship 7. As I mentioned, during the second orbit, an indicator light indicated that the heat shield was no longer locked in place on the spacecraft. Now, of course, the heat shield was critical for protecting the astronaut on re-entry. So what Mercury Mission Control decided to do was they told Glenn to keep the retro package in place. You'll remember those retro rockets that were located on the bottom were held in place by 3 cables. Rather than jettisoning the retro package, they would keep it in place during re-entry so that those cables on the retro package could hold the heat shield in place. Ultimately, it turned out to just be a spurious signal from an incorrect sensor. The heat shield was fine, and John Glenn survived the mission just fine. So there's the launch of Mercury Friendship 7. After this, the goal of the Mercury missions was to sustain longer flights into space. So the next flight was Mercury Atlas 7 on May the 24th, 1962. Scott Carpenter flew the mission. Deke Slayton was originally supposed to fly this mission, but they discovered a irregular heartbeat, an atrial fibrillation in Deke Slayton beforehand. Deke Slayton would go on to be the head of the astronaut office through the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. He would not have flown into space until the early 1970s on the Apollo-Soyuz test project. So Scott Carpenter replaced Deke Slayton on this mission. This was the first human mission to have a couple scientific experiments on board. They were going to look at the behaviors of liquids in space, do some observations of the atmosphere of air glow, do some Earth photography. The mission lasted 4 hours and 56 minutes. Famously, during his mission, John Glenn reported seeing fireflies outside his window. These were little sparkly lights that seemed to be surrounding the spacecraft, orbiting around the spacecraft. We know today that they came from liquid dumps out of the capsule. As these liquids were dumped overboard, they would freeze and crystallize, and then as the sunlight caught these little ice crystals, they glistened in the atmosphere. Carpenter also saw these fireflies. At the time, it wasn't understood what they were, and he got distracted by them. And because he got distracted by them, he overshot his landing by about 250 miles. Flight director Chris Kraft was so angry at Carpenter over this that he lost confidence in Carpenter's ability to fly, and Carpenter never flew in space again. He left NASA just 2 years later in 1964. Shortly after Carpenter's flight in August of 1962, the Soviet Union flew Vostoks 3 and 4, and then there were other Mercury missions, Sigma 7, Faith 7, with Gordon Cooper. And so you'll notice the time building up here so that Vostok 3 flew for a total of 3 days, 22 hours. Vostok 4 flew for 2 days, 23 hours. The U.S. missions were increasing in length as well. Wally Schirra flew Sigma 7, where he was in space for 9 hours. Gordo Cooper was in space for just a day and 10 hours. Vostok 5 was in space for 4 days, 23 hours, a mission duration that would last for some time. And then finally, the first woman in space, I'll mention her, I'll show you a picture in a second, of Valentina Tereshkova, spent 2 days, 23 hours in space. In here, in September of 1962, between Vostok 4 and Sigma 7, NASA announced the second group of U.S. astronauts. This is called they called themselves, or were nicknamed, I should say, the New Nine. And they consisted of Elliot See., James McDivitt, James Lovell, Ed White, Tom Stafford, Pete Conrad, Frank Borman, Neil Armstrong, and John Young. I love looking at this picture in September of 1962 because they just didn't know what was ahead of them. Ultimately, as you look at this group photograph of these 9 new astronauts, 2 of them would die in the line of duty before anyone set foot on the moon. 6 of them would ultimately end up traveling to the moon, and 3 of them would end up walking on the surface of the moon. But of course, in September of 1962, they had no idea what was in their future. I've already mentioned Wally Schirra and his Sigma 7 mission for 6 orbits, 9 hours. Gordo Cooper for his Faith 7 mission, which was 22 orbits over a period of 34 hours, a day and 10 hours. Interestingly, in these days, NASA and the Soviet Union did not have full-time contact with the astronauts. NASA and the Soviet Union had stationed around the world both ships and ground stations that they would use to contact the astronauts, but the astronauts would only be in contact with the ground when they flew over one of these ground stations. They did not have full-time contact like we have today. Today we use geosynchronous orbiting satellites to be in full-time contact with the International Space Station or with the Crew Dragon capsule when it's in orbit. But that just wasn't true back in these early days. Now, of course, across the continental United States, there was a lot of coverage, but then as you got out over the oceans, there were long stretches where the astronauts would be out of contact with mission control. I mentioned the first woman to fly in space was a Soviet citizen, Valentina Tereshkova, and she flew on the Vostok 6 flight on the 19th of June in 1963, and she spent 2 days, 23 hours, so just an hour less than 3 days in space, and she was the first woman to fly in space. Well, now that the Mercury missions ended with Gordo Cooper's Faith 7 mission, the United States was moving on to the next phase of human spaceflight, and that next phase of human spaceflight was Project Gemini. The goal of Project Gemini was to prepare for Project Apollo. As we'll see when we talk about the Apollo missions to the moon, by the early 1960s, after Kennedy's May the 25th, 1961 challenge to land a human safely on the moon, or land a human on the moon and return them safely to Earth, NASA was beginning to prepare for lunar missions. Well, to prepare for the lunar missions, they needed something other than Mercury. They needed experience with flying multiple crew members at the same time. They needed experience with long-duration spaceflight. So the primary goal for Project Gemini was to develop the techniques that were needed for Project Apollo. And this included long-duration spaceflight. A mission to the moon and back again could take as much as 10 days. They needed to see how humans could live and survive and work in space for 10 days. They needed to get practice with and to perfect rendezvous and docking, the ability to dock and rendezvous two spacecraft together in space and dock them together. They needed experience with extravehicular activity, having an astronaut leave their spacecraft in a spacesuit and get experience spacewalking. And then finally, for Gemini, they needed to perfect the techniques of atmospheric entry and landing. So Project Gemini was developed. It would have 2 astronaut crew members. That's where the name Gemini comes from. Gemini, of course, means twins. And the launch vehicle that they would use is the Gemini Titan II, again, a modified intercontinental ballistic missile. And there were a total of 10 Gemini flights from 1965 to 1966. The Gemini spacecraft was designed to support 2 astronauts using a separate adapter module. So the Gemini spacecraft itself was essentially just a larger Mercury capsule. Now, it was not the Mercury capsule. It was increased in size, so the Gemini was significantly bigger than Mercury, had room to hold 2 astronauts, but it did not have enough room to hold all the supplies that the astronauts would need for up to 10 days in space. And so instead, that was located in the adapter module just below. It contained the power, propulsion, oxygen, water systems that would be needed to help the astronauts survive. They also decided with Gemini that instead of using an escape tower on top to pull the capsule away in case of an emergency, that instead the Gemini capsule was fitted with ejection seats. So in case of an emergency, the astronauts would be ejected out of the capsule. Of course, this is on launch. Once they're in space, they can't do that because they would have no way to re-enter the atmosphere. So the ejection system could only be used on launch if there was a problem during launch. In terms of powering the spacecraft, up until this time with the Mercury capsules and the Vostok capsules, they were all powered by batteries because the missions were relatively short in duration. Now that they were planning on longer duration missions, they would need to move from batteries to fuel cells. A fuel cell is a device where you take a fuel and an oxidizer, you mix them together to generate heat, and this heat is up against some metals, dissimilar metals, and when you heat one side and make the other side cold, electricity can flow across the junction between them. And so these fuel cells were used for powering later missions. Unlike batteries, they wouldn't run down. As long as you had fuel to power them, they would continue generating electricity. So the first couple Gemini missions were battery powered, the later ones were powered by fuel cells. In terms of guidance, Gemini was the first spacecraft to have computer-aided guidance. So there was an onboard computer. Now, fascinatingly, this onboard computer weighed 59 pounds or 27 kilograms. And it had a total of 4096 addresses, and you would address it with one 39-bit word. It had a total of about 160,000 bits altogether. For those of you that have done any computer program, you realize that by modern standards, this is an incredibly simple computer. And it was what was used to maintain attitude control. For propulsion on the spacecraft, they had 4 solid rocket motors that would be used for reentry. These didn't use liquid fuel, but in fact used solid fuel, very much like a bottle rocket today, for example. And attitude control while they were in orbit consisted of 16 thrusters using hypergolic fuels. Hypergolic fuels are fuels where, if you think about kerosene and oxygen, like the first stage of the Saturn V, when you mix them together, they don't automatically ignite. You need a spark or an igniter to get them going. Hypergolic fuels are ones when you mix the fuel and the oxidizer together, they automatically ignite. And that was the type of fuel they used for their thrusters. As we'll see here in a second, it's also the fuel that was used on the booster. So this is what the Gemini spacecraft looked like. There's 2 astronauts standing in the hatches of one of the Gemini capsules over there. Here's a comparison of it between the size of the Mercury capsule and the Gemini capsule. So you can see it was essentially a scaled up Mercury capsule. And then here's just a neat little diagram that shows you what's going on the inside. So we've got the 2 ejection seats where the astronauts would sit. Remember, they would spend the whole time in this little tiny capsule. The interior space on the capsule is sort of equivalent to the front seat of a compact car. So imagine spending 10 days with you and a buddy in the front seat of a compact car. Like the Mercury, it had a parachute system up here at the top for reentry, a reentry control system. This was the retrograde rockets that were used to bring the capsule home, and then this was the service module back here, the support system that had oxygen, water, communications, things that they would need while they were on orbit, but they would discard before coming home. So here's a picture of what one of the Gemini capsules looks like in space. This is Gemini 7, as photographed by the Gemini 6 spacecraft in December of 1965. So what was used to launch the Gemini? Well, it was the Titan II launch vehicle. The Titan II was an intercontinental ballistic missile developed by the U.S. Air Force. It too was powered by hypergolic fuels. The hypergolic fuels that it used was Aerozine 50. That's a 50-50 mixture of hydrazine and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. And the oxidizer that was used was nitrogen tetroxide. So we often just summarize it and say it was hydrazine was the fuel and nitrogen tetroxide was the oxidizer. The thing about both of these are they're highly poisonous to human beings, and they're extraordinarily dangerous because when they're mixed together, they automatically ignite with one another. However, that also makes systems using them simple. And the primary advantage to these for use in an intercontinental ballistic missile is that they're both stable at room temperature. If you think it up until this point, like with the Mercury Redstone using alcohol and liquid oxygen, or the Atlas Agena requiring a fuel and liquid oxygen is cryogenic, has to be kept at incredibly cold temperatures. That's not a great way to store an intercontinental ballistic missile because you're constantly having to keep that liquid oxygen replenished because it's warm, it's boiling away as quickly as it can. An advantage to using these hypergolic fuels is that both hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide are stable at room temperature. So you could fuel up this rocket, you could put it inside of a silo, a missile silo, and it could sit there for many months or many years waiting for the order to be launched, carrying its nuclear warhead up there on the top. And so that's why this particular fuel was chosen for this intercontinental ballistic missile. This particular rocket was chosen for the Gemini missions because it had enough thrust, it had enough power to lift the Gemini capsule into space. And so that's why they selected it. But as I said, because nitrogen tetroxide and hydrazine are poisonous to human beings, it was a very dangerous rocket to be around. Even a small fuel leak could poison someone. By the way, when hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide burn, they give off this very characteristic yellowish colored cloud. So when you see rockets launch, sometimes you will see these yellow colored clouds, and that's usually an indicator that they're using these hypergolic fuels. All right, here's a picture of one of the Titan II missiles inside a missile silo. At the beginning of the Gemini program in October of 1963, NASA selected astronaut group 3. They were nicknamed the 14. So there they are. You can look at their names over there on the side. A couple people that are worth mentioning in here is Michael Collins was selected. He would fly in Apollo 11. Buzz Aldrin was selected as part of astronaut group 3. He would fly on Apollo 11 as well. A couple of other astronauts, Alan Bean would fly to the moon, Gene Cernan would fly to the moon right here, were selected as part of the 14. Okay. In the meantime, the Soviet Union was continuing development of their spacecraft. They developed the Voskhod, which was Russian for Dawn or Ascent spacecraft. The Voskhod was a modified Vostok spacecraft, and the Voskhod was designed to carry more than one cosmonaut into space at a time. And the first mission that was launched to carry more than one astronaut was Voskhod 1. It was launched in October of 1964. So Voskhod 1 was the first multi-person crew. Now, the thing was, because they took the Vostok 1 spacecraft, which Yuri Gagarin had flown into space, and you'll remember he was sitting in an ejection seat inside there, they basically modified the Vostok 1 to hold 3 people instead of 1. There was no room inside the spacecraft for an ejection seat. There was no room for spacesuits. There was no room for an escape tower. So the 3 astronauts were crammed inside this tiny capsule with no escape, with no ejection seats, and no escape tower, and interestingly, no spacesuits. Now, Voskhod 1 also represents the first flight of non-pilot crews. So the 3 crew members for this, Vladimir Komarov was a pilot, but 2 non-pilots flew. Boris Yegorov was a physician, and Konstantin Fyokostov was an engineer, and he turned out to be the lead designer of both the Vostok and the Voskhod spacecraft. This was the first land recovery using a rocket package. They since they didn't have ejection seats, they had to come down, and they landed on land in the spacecraft. It used parachutes, and then there was a rocket package that was suspended up there in the parachutes that fired at the last second to slow them down right before they hit the ground. Another interesting story about the Voskhod 1 mission, again, October 1964, was that they had to come home early, and they came home early because of the retirement of Nikita Khrushchev. And I put retirement there in quotes. They left when Nikita Khrushchev was the premier of the Soviet Union, and when they returned, they were greeted by Leonid Brezhnev. NASA Administrator James Webb called Voskhod 1 a very significant development in human spaceflight because it was the first time that more than one person flew at a time. So that was the 12th of October, 1964. On the 18th of March, 1965, they flew the Voskhod 2 mission. Now, this was limited to 2 astronauts, Alexei Leonov and Belyaev, Pavel Belyaev, and this mission was famous for the first human spaceflight. So Voskhod 2 only carried 2 crew members because they needed the additional space to include an inflatable airlock. Now, the reason that they needed an inflatable airlock was that they could not evacuate the inside of the spacecraft. The spacecraft itself was kept cool using the air from the cabin and using fans and other things to keep the electronics cool. So if they evacuated the inside of the cabin, that is, if both astronauts put on their spacesuits and they let all the air out of the cabin, all the electronics would overheat. So in order to get Leonov outside the spacecraft to do his spacewalk, they needed an airlock. Well, the spacecraft was too small to have a large metallic or physical airlock, so they invented an inflatable airlock. Basically, they opened the hatch, they inflated this giant airlock. Alexei Leonov got out of the Voskhod spacecraft into the airlock. They closed the hatch to the spacecraft below. He then uninflated the airlock so that it was at vacuum, and then he floated out of the airlock into space. And this was the first spacewalk in history. It was only about 12 minutes long, because as soon as Leonov got outside, in fact, as soon as he depressurized the airlock that he was in, because there was no longer any air pressure pushing on the outside of the suit ballooned up very quickly. All the air pressure inside the suit ballooned the suit out. Because of this, he could hardly maneuver his arms at all. In fact, he had a camera, and he couldn't even reach the camera to take any pictures during his spacewalk. Well, as soon as he left the airlock, he very quickly started to overheat. There was a tremendous amount of exertion just trying to move his arms to work against the spacesuit to grab the camera and do the other tasks he was supposed to do. He very, very quickly became overheated. He started to sweat. His visor started to fog up so that he couldn't see. And to get back into the airlock, he found he couldn't do it feet first, so he had to crawl into the airlock head first. He got stuck in the process, and in order to get into the airlock, he had to deflate his suit. Now, the problem is when you drop air pressure like that, you run the risk of experiencing the bends, which is something that divers risk when they come from great depths up to lower depths. As the nitrogen bubbles are dissolved, as nitrogen's dissolved in their blood, it'll turn into bubbles if they drop the air pressure too quickly. And so he had to drop the air pressure, risking the bends just to get back into the spacecraft. Now, on top of this, there were multiple failures on re-entry. The big heavy suits that the crews were wearing, they had a hard time getting them back on in the cramped space inside the capsule. So the center of mass was off. The orbital module did not properly disconnect from the re-entry spacecraft, from the capsule with its heat shield that would re-enter. And they ended up landing 240 miles off target. And they were so far off target that it took the Soviet recovery forces a full day to find them, and they ended up having to spend a freezing night in the capsule by themselves until they were eventually recovered. Okay, so that was the Voskhod 2 mission. The very first of the NASA Gemini missions was on March the 23rd, 1965. It was commanded by Gus Grissom, and the pilot was John Young. This, of course, would be Gus Grissom's second flight into space. You'll remember on his first mission, the Liberty Bell 7 spacecraft sank, and because of that, Gus Grissom jokingly named Gemini 3 the Molly Brown from, of course, the unsinkable Molly Brown. NASA was unhappy with this, and it turns out that would be the last time that they would let the Gemini astronauts name their spacecraft. So the goal for this mission was to simply test the Gemini spacecraft. They completed 3 orbits of the Earth over 4 hours and 52 minutes. They did orbital maneuvering. It was the first time that a crewed spacecraft was able to do orbital maneuvering. In space before, they had done attitude control, where they changed the attitude of the spacecraft, but this was the first time the crew was actually able to use thrusters to change the orbit of the spacecraft. Another famous story that comes out of the Gemini 3 mission is that right before launch, one of the other astronauts handed John Young a corned beef sandwich, which he stuffed in the pocket of his spacesuit. And then during the mission, he took the corned beef sandwich out and had a snack during the mission. As he was eating it, little crumbs floated away, and NASA was quite upset about all of this because they were concerned about the crumbs getting in the equipment and possibly contaminating the equipment. And they were frankly just unhappy that the astronauts did this without their knowledge. The next Gemini mission was Gemini 4 in June of 1965. The commander was James McDivitt, and the pilot was Ed White. They completed 66 orbits of the Earth over 4 days, 4 hours. Now, you might remember when I was in Lecture 4, when we were talking about orbits, that I talked extensively there about the Gemini 4 goal of rendezvousing with the Titan II upper stage. So the upper stage of the rocket that put them into orbit was in the same orbit that they were. And the goal was on this first orbit around the Earth that James McDivitt would take the Gemini 4 capsule, reoriented, would thrust towards and would rendezvous with the Titan II. He wouldn't dock with it. He would just rendezvous with it and then keep close station with it. Stay very close to it for that first orbit around the Earth. And you might remember that as he thrusted towards the upper stage moved in weird ways. It moved down, below, and in front of him. As he lost sight of it. He turned his spacecraft to keep an eye on it, and then he thrust towards it again, and it kept moving in these weird directions. And you'll remember that was because neither NASA, the astronauts, nor their trainers really thought much about orbital mechanics. And it was because of this mission that NASA really had to think hard about how orbital rendezvous would occur and how to go about orbital rendezvous. Generally, that's forgotten in this mission because this mission also had the first U.S. spacewalk, the first U.S. extravehicular activity. Astronaut Ed White left the Gemini 4 capsule, carried with him a small maneuvering unit that just had pressurized gas in it. He could squirt that gas, and then that would push him around, action and reaction, you'll remember. So he had this handheld maneuvering unit. Ed White was having a good time outside, and eventually he had to be told to get back in. So it ended up being a 20-minute spacewalk. He was enjoying himself, although he did find that it was next to impossible to do anything. Again, as was seen with others, the spacesuit expanded expanded so much that he had a hard time maneuvering. He had nothing that he could grab onto. Ended up having to use the umbilical that you see there to pull himself back in. The Gemini 5 mission was the first mission that was intended to rendezvous do a very close rendezvous with another object. So the commander was Gordo Cooper and the pilot was Pete Conrad. They spent 7 days, 23 hours in space, and it was the first time that the United States set a duration record for the longest amount of time in space. They were going to eject a small little pod out of the Gemini 5 capsule and rendezvous with that pod. But unfortunately, some electronics problems prevented that from happening. So they ended up rendezvousing with a point in space. They had an imaginary point that they would rendezvous with, and they rendezvoused with that imaginary point. But this was the first test of being able to do orbital rendezvous. The first intention to dock with another spacecraft in space was the Gemini 6 mission. Now, Gemini 6 was a mission that was plagued with a number of problems. And in fact, as you'll see here in a second, Gemini 6 actually launched after Gemini 7. So the original mission of Gemini 6 was that NASA was going to do 2 launches on the same day. They were going to launch an Atlas Agena upper stage. So this was the Atlas rocket. Remember the Mercury Atlas rocket that was used to launch the Mercury astronauts into orbit. And they would attach to it here an Agena upper stage. And this Agena upper stage, it had fuel tanks, it had an engine on board. And the goal was that NASA would launch this into orbit, and then they would launch the Gemini 6 spacecraft a few hours later, and then Gemini 6 would actually dock. They would rendezvous, which means to get close, and would actually dock with this Agena booster. Unfortunately, the Agena booster blew up just after launch. And because it blew up just after launch, or I shouldn't say it blew up right after launch, it got fairly high, but then was lost. Presumably it exploded. Because the Atlas booster the Agena booster was lost, Gemini 6 didn't have anything to rendezvous with. So the mission was temporarily called off. The goal then was to launch Gemini 7 and have Gemini 6 rendezvous with Gemini 7. And so Gemini 7 was launched and Gemini 6 rendezvoused with Gemini 7, although they did not dock together. They just rendezvoused in space. Now, Gemini 6 ended up being launched. It was called Gemini 6A because it wasn't the original Gemini 6 mission. It was the mission that came, the redesigned mission to dock with Gemini 7. Launched on December 15th, 1965. It is famous because of a launch abort. The engines on the Titan II rocket fired, and they fired for about 1.5 seconds, but then they shut down. Now, they shut down right before they would have released the bolts that would have launched the rocket launched the rocket. Fortunately, the bolts hadn't released, the engine shut down, but all the indicators were that launch had occurred. In fact, the indicators in the capsule were that the rocket had lifted off the pad. Now, in that case, there's no way for the rocket to settle back down to the pad. And so what Wally Schirra should have done, the commander of Gemini 6, he had in the capsule a lever that he would pull to fire the ejection seats to eject the 2 of them. But because Wally Schirra never felt the rocket move, he never felt it lift off the launch pad, he felt that they had never actually lifted off, so he didn't pull the launch abort handle, which was actually probably quite fortunate. Because at this point, the rocket's sitting on the pad, they just had to take all the fuel out, they had to get the astronauts out, but they could reuse the rocket and the capsule again. Had he aborted, it likely would have destroyed the capsule, possibly destroyed the rocket. But more importantly, at the time, NASA did not realize the danger of having a spacecraft filled with pure oxygen. It's likely that when they lit those ejection seats inside the Gemini capsule, that would have caused an explosion that could very probably have killed the two astronauts. We'll see later on with the Apollo 1 mission the dangers of a spacecraft filled with pure oxygen. So they had been in that capsule for many hours, soaking in pure oxygen in a capsule filled with pure oxygen. It's likely they had to abort that it would have been fatal. So Gemini 7 was launched 11 days earlier on December the 4th, 1965, and it was meant to be a long-duration mission. They ended up spending 13 days, 19 hours in space to prove that astronauts could live and work in space for the duration of what would be an Apollo mission. The commander was Frank Borman. The pilot was Jim Lovell. They ended up being a passive target for Gemini 6A. So they launched Gemini 6A. Gemini 6 rendezvoused with Gemini 7 in orbit. I should mention, by the way, that the other reason for doing this was NASA needed practice with working with more than one spacecraft in orbit at a time. They realized in the Apollo missions that they would have the lunar module on the surface and the command and service module in orbit around the moon. They needed to get some practice working with two crews in space at the same time. So having Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 in space gave them that practice. So Gemini 7 was the longest space flight to date, and it proved that Apollo duration missions were possible. The next mission is Gemini 8, launched on March the 16th, 1966. The commander was Neil Armstrong and the pilot was Dave Scott. The goal for this was to do 4 dockings with an Agena upper stage. So again, this time they successfully launched an Agena target docking vehicle into orbit. These are photographs of it taken from Gemini 8. The goal was that Neil Armstrong and Scott would dock with the Gemini Agena upper stage, and they would dock with this, and in fact they had planned to do 4 dockings with it. They would then use the engine on board the Agena to change their orbit. They would spacewalk over to the Agena spacecraft. They had a planned 2-hour extravehicular activity by Dave Scott to go over and actually activate an experiment that was mounted on the Agena. But right after they docked, so here what you can see is a photograph taken from inside the Gemini spacecraft as they're coming up docking with the Agena target docking vehicle. Right after they docked with the Agena, the spacecraft started rolling very rapidly. Now, before launch, they had been warned that possibly the wrong software had been loaded on the Agena rocket. And if anything should go wrong, if anything should go strange after they were docked with it, they should undock from it. So because this uncommanded roll started up very quickly, Neil Armstrong, the commander who was flying Gemini at the time, decided to undock from the Agena and back away. So Dave Scott very quickly turned over control of the Agena rocket to ground control. Neil Armstrong separated the 2 spacecraft and backed away. As soon as he backed away, the Gemini spacecraft started rolling even faster. They had thought that the problem was with the Agena booster. Later, it turns out they would find out that the problem was with the Gemini spacecraft itself. One of the thrusters had stuck on. Now that they didn't have all that mass, all that inertia of the Agena booster holding them back, now that that thruster was firing with just a little light Gemini spacecraft, the roll developed very quickly. In fact, they began rolling at about 1 revolution per second. Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott both reported that they were very close to passing out. Rolling at this rate meant that they were undergoing forces that was drawing blood away from their brains. Armstrong had the presence of mind to shut off the Orbit Attitude and Maneuvering System, the OAMS. He shut it down. When he shut that down, it shut off the thruster. He had to, the spacecraft, though, was still spinning very rapidly, and so he had to turn on the reentry system, and he had to use the reentry system to slow down this roll, reorient the spacecraft. Now that they had control of the spacecraft again, they had to come home. The mission rules required that once the reentry system was activated, they had to come home. For a test, they turned the Orbit Attitude and Maneuvering System, the OAMS, back on, and they discovered that thruster number 8 was stuck on. So they discovered what the problem was. But as I said, once the reentry system had started, they had to come back. So they let Mission Control know that they needed to come back to Earth. Mission Control had them stay in orbit, stay up in space for an extra orbit so that they could land them. But instead of landing in the Atlantic as originally designed, they ended up landing in the Pacific, a few hundred miles south of Japan, where the backup recovery forces were located. This was the first true in-space emergency. You know, there were concerns earlier, I mentioned earlier in this lecture about John Glenn and concerns about his heat shield, but this was the first true in-space emergency that could have cost the lives of the astronauts. And what Dave Scott had to say about Neil Armstrong was the guy was brilliant. He knew the system so well. He found the solution. He activated the solution under extreme circumstances. It was my lucky day to be flying with him. And there are Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott sitting in the Gemini capsule floating in the Pacific Ocean. It took some time for them to be recovered because it was an emergency and they came back quickly. So they ended up having to spend a few hours bobbing around in the ocean. And in fact, the ocean was fairly rough where they were, and both astronauts and even some of the rescue divers ended up getting seasickness. The next mission was Gemini 9. And the original crew, Elliot C. and Charles Bassett, were tragically killed in a crash of their trainer aircraft, the T-38 trainer aircraft that NASA astronauts use to this day, in fact, to fly all over the country. They were going to St. Louis to visit the McDonnell Spacecraft Corporation, the McDonnell Aircraft Plant in St. Louis. They were going there to visit their Gemini 9 spacecraft. It was a cloudy day. They came in too low, and they ended up crashing their airplane, and both C and Bassett were killed in this crash. So, in fact, they ended up clipping one of the hangars and crashing just 500 feet away from the spacecraft itself. So the backup crew had to be activated, and that backup crew was Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan. Their goal was, again, to dock with one of these Agena targets, and they were going to conduct an ambitious extravehicular activity to test out a brand new astronaut maneuvering system, basically a backpack that would allow the astronaut to fly around. The problem is their Agena target also did not achieve orbit, so their Agena booster failed to achieve orbit, so their mission was canceled. Eventually, NASA did launch a separate vehicle, a backup vehicle called the Augmented Target Docking Adapter. So they then eventually launched to dock with the Augmented Target Docking Adapter. The problem was a metal band on the outside of the nose cone. So what you see here, the white is the nose cone of the rocket. That was there to protect the docking adapter while it was being launched. This metal band on the outside didn't release as it was supposed to, which meant that the payload shroud did not release. And when they got into orbit, the payload shroud was still attached. And of course, that was the end where they were supposed to dock to it. There was some consideration given to having Cernan actually go out in a spacewalk and cut this metal band, but they were afraid that that metal band was under tension, and when he cut it, it would snap, and that could possibly puncture his spacesuit. And so they decided, they ended up rendezvousing, but not docking with this augmented target docking adapter. Stafford joked that it looked like an angry alligator. So when they rendezvoused with it, they told NASA that it looked like an angry alligator out there rotating around. Gene Cernan did do a spacewalk. You'll remember that the goal of this spacewalk was to test out the first maneuvering unit. The maneuvering unit was actually stored in the bottom of the Gemini spacecraft. He would get out on his spacecraft, translate around to the bottom of the spacecraft, strap on this maneuvering unit, and then use that to do some test flying around. The problem is, as soon as Cernan got out of his spacecraft, he encountered the same problems that every spacewalker before him encountered. His suit quickly ballooned up. He had a hard time moving his hands. Anything he tried to do took a tremendous amount of physical exertion. He quickly overheated. He quickly started to sweat. His visor fogged up. He had trouble seeing. Cernan couldn't get the backpack strapped on because, again, he was having so much trouble maneuvering and moving around and overheating that eventually the spacewalk was called off. Cernan actually had a lot of trouble getting back into the Gemini 9 spacecraft. It was realized after this that spacewalking, at least without prior planning, was not going well, and NASA was going to have to do something different. Gemini 10 was launched in July of 1966. The commander was John Young. The pilot was Michael Collins. They spent 2 days, 23 hours in space, completed 43 orbits. And in this case, this was the first time that a spacecraft was able to dock with multiple Agena targets. That very first ever docking was Gemini 8 with Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott. This time they were able to dock with multiple Agena targets. They docked with an Agena target that was launched for them. They also went back and they docked with the Gemini 8 Agena target. They ended up docking with an Agena and using it to boost their orbit up to an altitude of 412 miles above the surface of the Earth. And as I said, they docked with the Gemini 8 Agena. They also conducted 2 spacewalks. Michael Collins conducted 2 spacewalks as part of this. And again, ran into all the same troubles that spacewalkers had run into before with overheating and fogging up. Gemini 11 was launched in September of 1966. The commander was Pete Conrad. The pilot was Dick Gordon. Again, 44 orbits, 2 days, 23 hours in space. They also docked with an Agena target. They used their Agena to boost themselves up to an orbit that was 853 miles high. And that was the highest that humans had ever been at that point. They also tethered themselves to the Agena. They used, here you can see a cable to tether themselves to the Agena booster, and they ended up putting both themselves and the Agena in a spin, and they used that to create artificial gravity. They conducted 2 extravehicular activities, and they ended up docking and undocking 5 times. So at this point now, NASA was quite confident in their ability to rendezvous 2 spacecraft close together in space and dock and undock these spacecraft. NASA was becoming very proficient with understanding the orbital mechanics of rendezvous and docking. The one thing that still needed to be worked out was extravehicular activity. And that was done on the last Gemini mission, Gemini 12, which was launched in November of 1966. The commander was Jim Lovell. The pilot was Buzz Aldrin, who of course would fly on Apollo 11. They were in space for 3 days, 23 hours for 59 orbits. They conducted 3 extravehicular activities outside the spacecraft. But this time, for the first time, they had put handholds and footholds on the outside of the spacecraft. See, before when the astronaut went outside, there was nothing they could grab, right? There might be an antenna or something on the outside of the spacecraft, but you don't want to grab that because you need the antenna. So for the first time, they put foot restraints and they put handholds on the outside of the spacecraft. So Buzz Aldrin, who did the spacewalk, was able to translate around the outside of the spacecraft. In addition, it was the first time that NASA had used underwater training to teach the astronauts what walking in space would be like. They also docked with an Agena booster. They had a problem with their Agena booster, which meant that they could not boost themselves to a higher orbit. But the important thing here was this was what I would argue was the first very successful spacewalk. Buzz Aldrin was able to do 3 spacewalks. He didn't go out of the spacecraft in all of them, but he was able to, for the first time, easily move around, translate around the spacecraft, and conduct his tasks. One remarkable thing that I want to point out about the Gemini program is the cadence of launches. If you look here, you'll notice that the Soviet Union launched Voskhod 1 and 2. And then if you look at the string of Gemini missions, they all occurred between March of 65 and November of 66. So you'll notice that there was March of 65, June of 65, August of 65, December of 65, December of 65, March of 66, June of 66. Every few months, the United States was launching another Gemini mission. It's the kind of launch cadence that NASA would never see again. NASA would never launch this many missions in that short a period of time. While NASA was flying the Gemini missions, the Soviet Union was working on the development of their new Soyuz spacecraft. And the very first test flight of the Soyuz spacecraft was on April the 23rd, 1967, and Vladimir Komarov was the astronaut that flew it. Now, this was the second space flight for Vladimir Komarov. Yuri Gagarin was actually his backup for this flight. And this was the flight of the new 3-person Soyuz spacecraft. You'll remember that the Voskhod was just a modified Vostok. It wasn't designed for 3 people. They just managed to cram 3 people in there. Soyuz, however, was designed to hold 3 cosmonauts from the very beginning. So the goal of this mission was to test the Soyuz spacecraft, and they were also, after Soyuz 1 launched, were going to launch Soyuz 2. And the 2 of them would meet up in space, and they would actually exchange crew members via an extravehicular activity. The problem is Soyuz 1 from the very beginning was plagued with problems. Right after launch, one of the solar arrays did not deploy, so the spacecraft was starved for energy, was starved for electricity. The automatic attitude control system failed almost right away. The manual system after that wasn't working very well. On entry, and because of these things, the mission was cut short. Komarov was sent home, came home. The main parachute did not deploy from the Soyuz spacecraft. He manually fired the reserve parachute, but the reserve parachute got tangled up with the drogue parachute. And because it got tangled up, it did not deploy, and the Soyuz spacecraft came crashing down to Earth at well over 100 kilometers per hour. Komarov, of course, was killed in the accident. And Vladimir Komarov is the first human to have been killed in spaceflight. And he was killed when his parachutes did not reopen on the Soyuz 1 spacecraft. In the end, because of the problems that Komarov was experiencing in space and because of a thunderstorm, Soyuz 2 ended up not launching, which is fortunate because Soyuz 2, they would have likely lost that crew because many of the problems with Soyuz 1 probably also existed with Soyuz 2. Well, this was the beginning for the U.S. of the Apollo missions. In our next lecture, I will talk about the Apollo missions to the moon. We will start with the Apollo 1 fire, and then I will go through the Apollo missions, and we will talk about NASA Apollo. In the meantime, the Soviet Union is working on perfecting their Soyuz spacecraft as well. So interspersed with the Apollo missions, you will see the Soyuz missions. But Gemini laid the foundations for Apollo. They demonstrated that orbital rendezvous and docking were possible. They perfected the techniques of extravehicular activity. They showed that you could have long-duration spaceflight. And with the success of Gemini comes NASA Apollo. So join me in the next lecture when we will talk about the Apollo missions to the moon.